So in terms of funding, and particularly in terms of capacity, building the capacity of policymakers and other stakeholders in the continent, to be able to perform better. The bank did make available, I think, up to about $10 billion in the initial stages, to help the countries build their resilience, to fight the pandemic. And over the last several months, efforts are also continuing, to support the regional member countries to fight this. In terms of capacity, the complex, or the department that I represent, is also has had series of e-seminars and webinars with global experts, not only African experts, but global experts, and especially in the African member countries, to discuss issues around the pandemic, and what appropriate responses these countries can take, to help fight the effects of the pandemic. So through this period, there have been series of webinars on building macroeconomic resilience, supporting the youth in their innovation efforts. There have been webinars on how to align the healthcare system, and in different areas. So in a way, we're looking at it from the angle of, yes, funding, but at the same time also building the capacity, to that the funds can be used effectively. So this is from the side of the bank. What I also do personally, the other cap, is volunteering my time, to train and to help develop young Africans, as they are locked down, in the period of the pandemic, but also what they can do, after the pandemic. And I was fortunate to have about 60, innovation experts from about 25 countries, who also, agreed to join, to give their time, to really take these young Africans through a series of master classes and coaching, what we call the innovation program. So yes, on one hand there is the official role, but on the other hand, also as an African, many of us are also, in our own capacity, giving time, to support in science and innovation within the continent. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Foster. And it's truly remarkable what happens when we're under pressure and we're forced to
going all remote. So going from supporting physical offices to over close to 2,000 humans as part of our larger network. Some lessons that we learned. When the internet became our headquarters, we became more open to hiring and seeking talent across all of Africa and beyond. And it gave us a talent liquidity and an access to more youth in a way that we previously were quite constrained. While internet and power connectivity has increased in most major cities in Africa, it was really critical at the individual person in their home desk ability to have reliable access. So access is one thing, but reliable access was the other. This often meant partnerships with service providers, but also having to really pay up and invest in additional stipends for our employees. The pandemic, more so than working remote, also brought on additional stresses, and we needed to ensure that the culture of caring was really emphasized, whether this was additional forgiveness and support for caregivers or for young people who were working now within the context of their family homes, but also the increase in the working hours and what was required to give additional medical and psychological support given the outbreak. And while we transitioned quickly and effectively, there were bumps, and we had to really practice and put to practice a lot of our own thought leadership on remote first ways of working. That we have seen in our client engagements or our customer engagements drive better outcomes than the in-person equivalent. And I'll speak to this next. So there's a lot Andela has learned and shaped into thought leadership on remote first practices, given our work helping hundreds of engineering teams to think about how they not only onboard, but set their remote teams for long-term embedded success. We've also learned a lot working with clients like GitHub, Cloudflare, and Envision, who have designed standards and mature remote first practices. As an example, Envision, one of our customers, has proven that it is not only possible as a 100% remote organization, but also necessary to become remote first, to be remote first, to take highly collaborative processes like ideation and design to build an even better product. This took being intentional about their team's culture to have a balance between productivity, health, and fun. So to speak a little bit about how might you be thinking about this in the construct of your organizations. Remember earlier I said it really does require some creating some design and being intentional in how you approach it. With the COVID lockdowns, most companies, and perhaps some of yours, are simply in the replication phase. So standing meetings that you had in person simply moved to remote. And now there's an overemphasis on live in-person meetings, which having to do that every day, all day, really becomes quite tenuous at best and not necessarily increasing productivity. To evolve, the design starts to apply. You need to think about the structures and processes that must evolve to benefit your teams culturally and operationally, but also have an impact on your performance, and also gives you competitive advantage. Formalization is the implementation part. This is where you would have developed a remote work philosophy and would have embedded it into your organizational culture. So thinking about how do your values and the ways of working rely on in-person discourse versus if it were all remote. Maturity is where some of our clients are. This is where you start to see the competitive advantage. And oftentimes, this is when your team is working better as a remote and asynchronous team than an in-person team. So what does it take to be able to shift through these stages? Mindset, moving from popping in or walking in to a model that is more self-service and really one that is a shared learning mindset. So where and how do you share information so others can access it when they need it? How do you build the organizational muscle for over-communicating and seeking feedback? From a culture perspective, how do you move from water cooler interactions and in-person culture building, so the barbecues, happy hours, to building remote communities? This might be driven by where and how you recognize your team. How do you let the teams create fun, team bonding, and ways in which you remind us that we're all human and build empathy and spaces for common interests? From a process perspective, we're so engineered for in-person and face-to-face conversations. How do you think about frameworks for detailed documentation and over-communication? What tools are most productive for this? Structurally, this means moving away from the need to collaborate synchronously to asynchronously. And there's a lot of technology tools that make this really easy, like Loom, Envision, Miro. And it may not work for all work circumstances, but certainly for the majority of things that need to get done by your teams, these are some things to consider. All right, so shifting away from the organization to the topic of this panel, which is youth and how are they transitioning? With a captive community of about 80,000 in the Andela learning community and over 1,000 in the Andela talent network, we often poll and seek feedback on leading indicators for motivation, engagement, and productivity. And here are some insights. Certainly, with the pandemic and going all remote, job security and fear of the unknown is driving a strong desire to keep growing and keep increasing their skills base. They're actively seeking opportunities to grow, and we're also seeing an increase in using those skills and creating additional revenue streams. So yours may not be their only way of earning money. While also seeking job security, they're also really valuing and starting to demand a level of independence that comes with being remote. They prefer optimal flexibility and autonomy with schedule and personal time management. Allow them to do their work, don't dictate the when and how. We were quite surprised that even with this push towards independence, there's a strong sense of belonging within the networks that we've created. We've seen the natural formation of small teams that enhance this collective accountability and motivation. These have become less geographic based and more so about interests and opportunities. They are passionate about elevating their communities and certainly the next generation. They have a strong, strong sense of what it means to share knowledge, but also to build each other up. Sort of the sense of we are all better off if we are collectively sharing and learning together. There's still a lot to be done in developing the science behind remote communities, but I suspect we will learn more in this panel and in the near term as remote first matures into the necessary norm. Thank you for the opportunity to share Andela's experiences transitioning to remote first, and certainly the impact it's had on the youth that we engage with. I really do hope to hear more about how you've applied remote first approaches, and certainly to discuss more in our Q&A session. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Wambui, for that very introspective perspective on work-integrated learning. Sylvia, I'd like to invite you to take the lead on your discussion right now, and please feel free to go ahead. Sorry, Sylvia, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here today. I'm going to talk about my experiences leading a remote internship project early this year when the COVID lockdown was at its peak, and relate that to the work I'm currently doing at the MasterCard Foundation and the prospects of remote work for the continent. So with the project that we undertook, it was basically a call to match students with employers who had to lay off their workers, who were being forced to go digital because everybody was under lockdown and everything was moving digitally. And on the other side, we also had students who had their internships being cancelled or their jobs being put on hold because organizations were struggling to keep up with COVID restrictions. And so a lot of recruitment decisions had been put on hold. So the intention was to find other pathways for students to gain the work experience or the first jobs that they needed once they were graduating from school. So on the demand side, employers needed them, and on the supply side, students also, needed the opportunities. So it was easy to make that match. Now, the lessons we learned in facilitating this program, first on the employer side, which we're calling the demand side, is never to assume that because they are employers, they understand and know what to recruit for and how to recruit for the talent that they need. Why we say this is because we basically started out not knowing what to expect, right? But when the first call went out, there was a lot of interest from employers, and a lot of them were SMEs, and they elaborated the problems that they were having with personnel at the time, but did not know exactly how they could integrate someone remotely into their team and what exactly they could give to that remote person to work on. What aspects of their operations could be handled remotely. So on our team's side, we had to do a lot of work with employers to help them figure that out, to draft job descriptions that they would be able to send out and attract people to apply for these roles. And so that work with employers to help them to understand what aspects of the operations could be done virtually really helped with getting the roles out there. And then another thing we learned, with what we has also mentioned, is about onboarding and creating a sense of community. In Andela's case, it's been a good experience because, well, it's always been in their plans. But for the SMEs that we dealt with, it had never been in their plans to go remote. And so onboarding interns or first-time employees virtually was a big deal. And, people used all sort of, systems like having a buddy system, some informal check-in meetings to try and create that sense of community because you want the people working with you to feel belonged. And then there was a problem of supervising interns virtually. Again, there wasn't enough preparation on the employer's side to do that, and having to adopt new technologies to be able to do that. Trello was one tool that a lot of people had to adopt to do this. And what we realized that peer learning is important even amongst employers. We always talk about peer learning with students, but we quickly realized that with employers as well, peer learning was very important. On the student side, learnings were first the fact that young people do not necessarily attach the same professionalism to virtual work as they do with in-person work. There's a feeling of I am home, so I sometimes don't show up meetings dressed apart, or come into meetings late. The level of professionalism we noted wasn't necessarily the same as when they were doing in-person internships or starting work in person. And one learning was also the
with us. We say that the pandemic presented both a challenge and opportunity. A challenge in a sense that some of the activities that we were doing as a company, including how we used to generate revenues in the US and in other parts of the world, when you shut those value chains, you're simply having to struggle with your employees. So we say, how can we use what we have to respond to the pandemic? Because what we do is to harness our biodiversity hotspots in Africa in sourcing enzymes that are used in diagnostic applications. But we were not using those for diagnostics, but rather for normal molecular biology research, which is a field that is mostly involved with DNA manipulation, DNA analysis, etc., or genetic manipulation and analysis of viruses, humans, plants, etc. So we had to pivot to look at the problem that we were going to face as a country, but as a continent, and say, let's use our resources and our capabilities to then see how we can replace some of the imports that we know very well that are going to be scarce. And we know what happened in the pandemic. Most countries were stopping the export of certain key resources because they had to utilize those resources for themselves. And we've seen that now even with the vaccine. The same thing is happening where rich countries are protecting themselves by 3 times more than what they are required. So we as Africa has to be in a position whereby we are able to use what we have to advance and safeguard the lives of our people, but more so to contribute to the global solutions that be. Because the problem that we're facing now is a classic example of what could come. As this pandemic starts, the new waves are coming through, and eventually you will agree that this is just a classic example of what could happen around the world. Should anything wrong go? Where are we as Africa in terms of innovation that respond to a solution to save the lives of our people, especially in rural communities? I think that's where I wanted to touch, complementing what my colleagues have already laid a good foundation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And it's interesting the importance of insourcing and looking at nationalism. And there's an old saying, what forms under pressure? And we all know diamonds. And I think that's the opportunity here in Africa, looking at the next generation of innovators and looking internally again, working with what is available. And I think we're going to need leaders such as yourself to, catalyze that future for Africans to be able to support that infrastructure and also to be able to propel the future. So thank you for that perspective. I think it's truly enlightening. The next question is for you, Daniel, as well, because you're able to go through this process and come up with testing for COVID-19 in this situation. I'd like for you to elaborate on the idea behind your innovation and the steps that you took to be able to rapidly deploy this with the constraints that you had during COVID-19. Can you talk to us about your innovation and that journey?
So, our journey has been a short one because initially we wanted to pace ourselves, take things step by step, supply reagents, PCR reagents to researchers because that's sort of a solution that we wanted to provide because most of them were really delaying to graduate because at times they wait up to 6 months for reagents. Unlike where you are, Dr. Mogo, you order today. I mean, within 1 hour you can have your reagent. In Africa, it can take up to six months, and that is a big problem because that delays our innovation. So part and parcel of our solution was to say, how can we enhance Africans to be able to conduct their research so that they can finish their work, so they can publish and patent and do all that they need to do in order to advance the scientific community in Africa, especially given pandemics of this nature where you need the very same people to innovate. How will they innovate if they don't have reagents? So ours was to respond to that. But we had to say, let's look at what we have.
Movement and access, having to work, the option to work from home provides opportunities for these young people to be able to do that. And then with refugees, there are various policies in the various countries of asylum that prevent them from entering the workforce. And so they are not able to access jobs in the countries that they are seeking asylum in. And so, breaking down barriers means that I could be a refugee living anywhere and be working anywhere on the continent or in any part of the world. And with women as well, even when young women enter the workforce, sometimes for childbearing or other family emergencies, they sometimes would have to make that difficult choice to leave employment, to stay at home for a while, to be able to take care of whatever's happening in the family. And so remote work would be able to allow them to conveniently combine both if that option is available. And so for us at the Mastercard Foundation, we see this as an opportunity. And so to the question whether young people are ready for virtual work opportunities, definitely they are. I mentioned earlier that they are digital natives, so it's not new. But we also realize that there's some interventions that we need to put in place to allow young people fully benefit from remote work. And I'm just going to go through these interventions. First is education and skills building. Like I mentioned with the project we had, the school we dealt with had a career services program that was very robust, that had prepared students with employability skills. So they were work ready. It was just a matter of connecting them. So first of all, education needs to provide that. Education needs to not just provide a theory and a classroom knowledge, but the professional development as well. And so career services as part of education, especially in the secondary and tertiary levels, are important for us to be able to do this. Introducing digital skills into our curriculum is also very important. So in as much as young people are digitally, savvy, it doesn't necessarily mean that, being savvy on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn would translate into being able to do digital marketing. So these skills need to be intentionally inculcated in our curriculum so that students are understanding what digital marketing actually means, not just posting on Instagram. And we also need to have, education that hones teamwork, communication, all the soft skills that I've earlier, elaborated that were being required by the employers that hosted the interns, and making sure that we're equipping our career services professionals to do the work they have to do. And on the policy side, when we mentioned that internet connectivity in their homes should be fast, it should be reliable, and data cost should be as cheap as possible to allow young people access it to do the work that they need to do. Access to computer, like I mentioned, it was one of the enablers in the project that we run. We need policies that facilitate acquisition, that make it easy for young people to have them, or we need to have avenues where it's easy for young people to access a computer somewhere in their community if they don't have it personally. And then in terms of systems, we may need to have community co-working spaces. Like I mentioned, if you have a young person in a place where space and privacy is an issue, they won't be efficient working from home, and they won't be efficient in any kind of virtual or remote work experience. So we need to start thinking around creating spaces in communities where young people can go to and share a working space. And then we need to have better ways of connecting young people to virtual opportunities. Is one thing creating the opportunities, is another thing making it accessible and visible to young people to access them. And then on the employer's side, there's the need for collaboration with education, because education was trying to now catch up with preparing young people for physical work, and overnight they now have to deal with preparing young people for remote work. So there's a need for collaboration and sharing of ideas and training the young people together so that they graduate with the skills that employers are looking for. And then, we can't expect to train somebody with physical internships and expect them to graduate into a virtual work environment and be able to thrive from the get-go. So employers would need to start providing virtual internships so that students who will be graduating would already have that experience whilst they were in school. And very importantly, we need policies at workplaces that pay stipends to interns. There are a lot of unpaid stipends on the continent, and a lot of times it's assumed that when you're working virtually, we've given you data, so you shouldn't need anything. But rather, if a student is from a background where they use their vacation period to fend for themselves and make an income to pay for their bills and to feed themselves, working for you means they may not be able to do these other gigs that they usually involve themselves in. And so without that stipend, it makes it difficult for a young person to even take up a remote internship, even though they don't physically have to commute and incur transportation costs. And then we need structures in the workplaces. Wambi has alluded to this, that facilitate remote work, that allow young people to develop professionally, to create networks. That's how we're going to attract young people to want to work remotely in an organization or in a working environment. And also we need to think about inclusion and equity with the populations that I already mentioned, for persons with disabilities, for refugees, for young women. Remote work allows us that opportunity to do inclusion and diversity in our workplaces in a very easy way. And so we need to start thinking of policies that allow us to be very diverse and inclusionary in recruitment and in the kind of roles that we make available. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for your presentation. I really like the whole point of inclusion and openness, and seeing COVID as an opportunity to move the innovation needle forward on work-integrated learning. With that said, Judine, you have the table. Please feel free to go ahead.
Great, thanks, Peter. I will. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of today's session. I've learned a great deal already. It's inspiring to hear about the work that's happening. So before I get into sharing some of the research that we've done, I thought it would be useful for me to share a little bit about the context in which this research is being done. So the University of Waterloo is a research-intensive university. It's located about an hour west of Toronto in Canada. Our university was founded in 1957, and one of the defining features was the creation of a co-op education program, the first of its kind in Canada. And one of the things that we're best known for, we have about 23,000 undergraduate students. That's about 70% of our undergraduate population that participates in co-op programs. And that involves them typically alternating between 4 months of study and in courses and 4 months in paid full-time work terms. And so over the course of their undergraduate degree, our co-op students complete between 4 and 6 of these 4-month work terms. In order to support the program, we have a global network of employers, about over 7,000 of them in companies around the globe. And lastly, we are the home of the Work Learn Institute. So with so much of our brand associated with co-op, it's in our best interest to study and continue to advance it. And so the Work Learn Institute is a research institute focused on conducting research on co-op and other forms of work integrated learning, and to really understand the impact of those practices for students and for the host organizations and employers. I'm going to talk briefly today about 3 studies that we've done. Of course, if you're interested in hearing more, I'll be happy to share links to materials that we have. We are in the midst right now of a study with our fall, so September to December work terms. We're investigating the remote work onboarding strategies that employers have used. And so while this research is still underway, I can share some preliminary results with you. So we've done this study. About 700 students responded to a survey. We asked, of the things we asked them, one of the things we asked them about was the type of onboarding activities that they participated in. These are all students who participated in fully remote work terms this fall. And this is what we heard from them. So we've grouped the activities into 4 categories according to what they shared with us. The first, they talked about welcome messages they received. Those may have been an email, a letter, a phone call, a Zoom call with a manager or senior leader within the organization, or it may have been a public announcement made by the company. A number of other onboarding activities included scheduled meetings. So the topics for those meetings might have been introductions, goal setting with the students, as well as training for specific tasks. Students were also often involved in introductory sessions, and so those may have been company-wide orientation sessions or sessions scheduled with specific team members, HR, or senior leaders within the companies. And lastly, students indicated a number of resources that were given to them to get them started. And those included things like contact information lists, introductory schedule or work plan to help the student get started. And sometimes it included a co-op student manual or a website that they could consult for additional information. When we did look at the onboarding tactics used, we examined it. One of the first ways that we've examined it is by looking at the size of the organization. So from a very small organization, 1 to 10 people, all the way up to organizations that had more than 1,000 people. And we did notice that there were some commonalities in terms of the tactics used. So it was fairly common for students to receive a welcome message from their manager, and for their manager to set aside a block of time to meet with the student. This is similar to what we would see in a face-to-face experience for students. One of the things that we've heard in past research from managers that investing time at the front end of the work term really pays dividends. So getting the student set up and off on the right foot seems to be a good success strategy. And
African emancipation economically and beyond just economy. And if we do not get rid of these red tapes, we are likely to face the same challenge even with the vaccine and even beyond that. I like the work that Foster was speaking about because it speaks about how to harness different capabilities, put them in the same room, and make sure that they rub shoulders with each other, that they share resources and expertise. In that format, they bring about that solution. In our journey, we realize that maybe it's something that is not ideal to speak about, but we realize that most African countries or most African laboratories that are doing this type of research prefer, products from Europe or US or even China. Self-belief is very critical if you want to stabilize an African continent. Africa has potential, and we have proved this over and over. And I believe that we need to trust in ourselves. I think I said in one platform that we are revered or loved by international players than we are, by Africans, which is not, proper, because Africans should be proud of what they are doing. See how you can complement what others are doing to enhance the ecosystem. We can share the resources with other African laboratories doing testing. In fact, we can donate resources. We are not all about money, we are about impact. The genesis of the company was about making sure that we contribute to African scientific community. And we do not deserve some of the red tape that we face, but it's part of business, it's part of the startup environment, it's part of competition. But in the face of a pandemic, you do not need to borrow money to buy something that you can get next door from your brother. So these are the challenges, these are the stuff that some of them that we faced, even though we are offering the solution. But I think apart from that, we collaborate with researchers at universities and research councils to innovate so that we can take those innovations to the market as a company. And that has inspired those that we're working with to even do more, to respond and have solutions that we can present to our local markets and even international markets. It is very critical that African scientists find a common ground where they set up foundations for innovation and value chains and distribute in China for their technologies. Not to study science for the sake of science and publication. Yes, knowledge economy is very critical, but science without an impact is useless. I'm sorry. It's not science, it's just you bragging about what you do in your laboratory. If it does not feed an African child, then it doesn't belong in Africa. Maybe it belongs somewhere where there's money. Here, we need to create science that have a meaningful impact. And this is the journey that we have started, and we are collaborating with researchers that are at universities and research councils. But still, even through that, there are still challenges whereby the competition with multinationals tend to take us and put us on the side, and at times self-belief and trust from our own clients disable us from scaling up our technology so that we can expand it throughout the continent and beyond.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think a lot of provocative thoughts for us to take away and think about. Dr. Mogo, would you like to add to that question before we move forward?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. I love what you said was music to my ears around doing impactful science. I was just thinking that, it's predicted that there's going to be more pandemics, right? And so we have to, I think a big part of this question of rapidly scaling innovations is sort of, again, that question of access, So now people are talking about COVID vaccines, and I recently read this article about how there's a lot of sort of the global politics of that, where there's questions around intellectual property, there's questions around, okay, how do we make it accessible and for low-income countries? And then having infrastructure, for example, to store. So these are all questions around like one innovation. We have a lot of digital health tools, and then the question becomes like, there's that tendency when we have digital health tools to focus on who can pay, right? So what oftentimes you find that you're segmenting the market and then you're serving those who can afford it. But when you're looking at a health problem, the question is then, how do we make sure that these tools, or what kind of business models might make sure that these tools are accessible to those who might need it the most as well? You have information, sort of the project I worked on where we have information, it's there, but it might not be accessible in a way that people can use it. You might have diagnostics, but then there's no power. So there's that whole question of access. I think one important thing is that how we think about designing solutions as well, making sure that there's that if we want to have Pan-African solutions, we also have to involve like communities and the population, not just in deployment, but in design as well of solutions. So that's one thing I wanted to add to the discussion. And then another thing I was thinking about was some of the challenges that Daniel was mentioning, because we sort of have to think proactively about the ecosystem and not just the solution. So it's like, how do we shape the market for what we want, right? And this becomes very important when we think about the fact that we're going to have more pandemics, right? So there's solutions that we need to deal with the pandemic, but there's also solutions that we need to keep Africa healthy so that if a pandemic comes, we reduce that risk that a lot of people are going to die. And that gets us into the question of sustainable growth, sustainable development. And that gets us into the question of sustainable infrastructure. Because if people are living in cities where they're exposed to pollution, they don't have housing and all of that, you're basically putting people at risk for chronic diseases, which then makes them more likely to die in a pandemic. And for those kinds of solutions, then we need a lot of patient finance as well, because we're going to need a lot of investment in things that may not always work with sort of a traditional market model. So that means that if we want more of innovation around these long-term complex challenges, we also need to shape the market, and we also need patient finance. And I like what Daniel said about having the support of the government, impact investors, or whoever is sort of thinking of not just now what solutions, not just now just inventing, but what kind of inventions do we want to incentivize? Because if you have those kinds of policies, if you have R&D infrastructure invested in the solutions that we need, then we're going to support innovators to do more innovation around these challenges that we have. So I think thinking about that, what does it take to shape the market to have the innovations that we need is a very important question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mogo. And as I listen to you, what comes to my mind over and over again is the importance of systems-based thinking, right? When we think about a country or when we think about a continent, and when we think about sustainability, I think the other side of sustainability is systems-based thinking, because we can't have sustainability without thinking about all the actors. Another point that I think you made mention to is around open access. And I think that's a critical thing when we think about intellectual property during a global crisis. One of the things that our organization, Prepper Foundation, did after the first wave in May of this year, we were the first organization to do a global open innovation challenge for COVID-19 solutions. Following the principles of open science, I think that's necessary as we think about coming up with solutions, but making sure that there's fair access or creating a level playing field where somebody in Europe or in Australia or in the United States coming up with an innovation should come up with creative ways building on the pillars of open science so that there's open access, open collaboration, and mobilizing that knowledge more and more. The last thing that I heard from you that I just want to reaffirm is the importance of public and private sector collaboration, right? We can't do this work alone. It requires close collaboration with government, the private sector, the entrepreneurs that are behind the innovations. There needs to be an open dialogue for that to take place. And so I wanted to thank you for highlighting those key points and reaffirm that for the listeners today. Moving on to the next topic that we want to talk about. In terms of the observed frameworks that you believe should continue to be strengthened, and I think we started to talk about this as well, in supporting the innovation works that you're working on or collaborating in, what are some of those frameworks, and where do you see areas for further development? Perhaps we can start with Foster and continue the conversation from there.
Okay. I hate to disappoint you, but I think personally, I think we need quite a bit of work to do to create the framework that works for Africa. I know that at the continental level, at national levels, there are innovation frameworks, including the STISA by the African Union, science, technology, and innovation for Africa, around which, the innovators in the continent are supposed to be pushed. But I do struggle, with existing, frameworks that have worked elsewhere, and how, whether or not they would work or continue to work in Africa. Um, we talked about ecosystem. Recently, I've been thinking about this. Actually, do we really have an ecosystem in Africa? As an ecosystem should work for innovation, because there is a framework, systems approach to innovation, which works in several places. But what I do notice is that within the continent, because a system comprises stakeholders, who work together and collaborate and share resources and all that. But what I do notice is that we do have these stakeholders, all right. They do exist.
And all the other things that schools have had to adapt to in this era. And one of the initiatives that we have running currently is an e-learning initiative where we are trying to get universities on the continent to be able to build robust structures to support e-learning for students. And we recognize that this is something that will not go away, even post-COVID, because we all see the benefits of e-learning and providing access and allowing flexibility when it comes to the work and the studies that young people have to do. And so that's one of the things that we are doing as a foundation to ensure that we do not go back to business as usual when this pandemic is over. And on the other side, with our Young Africa Work strategy, digitization and innovation is one of the core pillars that we have across all our country programs. And so we have digital teams that are working across industries and across sectors to digitalize some of the processes that we currently have and see how, moving digital will provide more opportunities for young people, but also be able to advance the work that organizations are doing and probably bring in more efficiency and profitability to industry.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on that concept?
Yeah, if I can, I think one of the things that we've learned through the Andela learning community is this notion of, while access is very important, and I think Sylvia has spoken to this, it's the way of learning. And so it's the work in practice, which sort of creates a sense of agility, but also learning with sort of smaller cohorts of like learning groups, and it doesn't really matter where they are. And so I think there's a bit of disruption about the notion of how we work and how we practice, that I think becomes really the way forward, and not going back to waiting for super structured ways of learning, and it has to evolve. So that's one of the areas that I think we've seen in terms of the future.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Judine, any thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things. So I think from an educational institution perspective that there's no doubt the changes that have been underway will be maintained in some way, shape, or form. We have employed 300 co-op students on campus as senior and online learning assistants, and they've been deployed out to the faculty since May, working with professors to help them create course materials that they can use in their remote classes. And I think that's been incredibly beneficial on a few fronts. It's given professors sort of a frontline view to the student side of things, but at the same time, it's giving the students the idea of what it's like to mount and run an online course. And so I think that's been a really effective strategy. And in doing that, I think that's going to have long-term impacts for how we present and engage, present content and engage with students in courses. I think on the work integrated learning side, I think this will become yet another way that employers can engage with students. I know that for some Waterloo students, the downside of this alternating 4 months work, 4 months school is needing to move every 4 months, and so remote work has the benefit of enabling them to stay put. And so I think there's no doubt that some students are going to see the amazing work, as Wambui mentioned, that organizations are doing, not just to adapt and replicate, but really to change the nature of work. And I think these students are going to be ready for that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Judine. I'd also like to touch upon the theme of hybridity. We've been hearing a lot of this, in our daily work as well as in the literature. Once the world goes back to quote unquote new normal, how do your organizations see this hybrid model manifesting itself in a day-to-day work basis? Do you see part of your workforce staying at home or staying remotely? Do you see a mix of the two? How does this model of hybridity manifest itself in your vision or in your organization's terms? Please feel free to go ahead.
Well, certainly as an organization, Andela's plan is to be remote first, but that does not mean that we will never, ever meet in person. And so there is an expectation that we would make, and I think Sylvia alluded to this earlier, this notion of some co-working spaces, because sometimes with all safety precautions taken into consideration, people do want to hang out together. We also, prior to the pandemic, saw greater correlation for our customers when our engineers were able to travel and be with them for a couple of weeks early on in the onboarding process. So I think those things are still important, and I think that that's probably where there will be some sense of in-person, but certainly really pushing to see how can we get remote to be the primary way of working or the way of engaging, and then certainly the in-person as being the complement to it as opposed to vice versa. You're on.
I will. I can. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the things that has struck me in different companies I've heard from is that right now many of us are experiencing remote work for the first time through the lens of a pandemic, and that remote work is different than that when we're not constrained by a pandemic. And I think that will be the next thing that we all those of us who are new to remote work will discover over the next year, hopefully, is the flexibility that it does enable people, and yet at the same time that as Wambui said, the ability to still get in person sometimes. So the hybrid model.
Sylvia, any perspectives from the MasterCard Foundation?
Not very different from what has been shared. We also foresee, having that kind of hybrid model, where the office is going to be one of the other places from where you can work, and so not necessarily having a designated working spot that you have to be in. So I think that's where we're also moving. Yeah.
Terrific. I'd like to open the floor to a few questions that have been asked by some of our participants. One of our colleagues from AIM Senegal is asking, how can employers evaluate the performance of an employee who is working remotely? So in terms of monitoring and evaluation, what sort of tactics have your organizations been implementing since COVID?
Well, Andela being an engineering organization, there are many tools, at least for our engineers, that allow us to evaluate productivity. And so in engineering terms, we'll look at things like the velocity, the quality. But I think for all roles, to be honest, it's really in how are you describing the outcome and the sense of what the quality, what good look like, and then the timing of it. And then how are you creating the structures, because things are agile and constantly moving, that allow you to understand when those outcomes might change. And then how do you evaluate, hopefully in sprints or in shorter cycles, how one is doing. And so I think it's an important question, Cedric, in that I think it is important for the success of remote first organizations to make sure that expectations are always upfront.
Mm-hmm. Right, fantastic. Any other thoughts? Okay, moving right along. We also have a question from one of our colleagues from Ames, Cameroon. A colleague is asking a question regarding to the organizational strategies of countries who don't have access to high-speed internet or low connectivity internet. What sort of approaches have you taken to mitigate those challenges? So again, low-speed internet or those who have low connectivity. Have there been any work done in that area?
So, unfortunately, because the business of Andela, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm speaking a lot, does involve being connected. So we have not solved for it. Through the Andela learning community, what we have been able to do is through the partnerships is find ways to allow the stipends that allow for some sort of better bundles, but where the infrastructure doesn't exist, I don't have the solutions. I know for some of our engineers in countries where reliability has been a problem, we will always then look to see are there partners where co-working spaces that might have the infrastructure that can support an individual, as opposed to us having to invest in an office. But Sylvia, I'd imagine you've seen a lot more of these.
I'm trying to recall some of them, but I think what readily comes to mind is I remember with the remote internship project was advising students and employers to, for people who had this constraint, to have periods, gauge the periods when connectivity was, good. And for some people, this was like midnight or in the wee hours of the morning where there are a lot less people online. And so working offline the whole day, if it's possible, or, having a way to download your work and be able to work on it online. And then when you do come online, be able to, send your emails for everything that needs to go out during that time. But in all of this, there's a need for communication. There's a need for understanding. People need to empathize with other people's situation for this to work.
Terrific. So thank you very much to our panelists and to our speakers. I'd like to wrap up by thanking you all once again for your very innovative work in work integrated learning in some very challenging times. We look forward to learning more about your work and some of the innovative aspects that you've taken to mitigate disruptive change. Likewise, please feel free to keep in touch. Hopefully, we'll have a whole series of links available following the NEF, the Next Einstein Forum. On that note, I'd like to thank you once again for speaking today, and I look forward to being in touch in the near future.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.